Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we dig into young activist efforts to ease the burdens government has heaped on entrepreneurs and look into the sorry financial condition of our more troubled states. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Eileen Norcross from the Mercatus Center, who reviews this year's rankings of states by fiscal condition. Up first, we'd like to welcome former Rhodes Scholar and NCAA champion Garrett Johnson, co-founder of SendHub and the Lincoln Initiative. Garrett, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. It's good to be here.
Garrett, I came of age in a tech world freed from the shackles of government interference when the Bell system was broken up in the early 1980s. And my generation went on to build the interconnected digital world many millennials now almost take for granted. Some of us felt that Silicon Valley sold out when John Doerr and others created TechNet in the late 90s and invited the federal government to dive back into our business. Since then, more and more of what the tech industry does has become politicized, and career politicians now relentlessly troll us, creating new tech controversies, mostly as a vehicle to scrounge for campaign contributions. Rather than trying to build firewalls to keep these people out, you seem to be pursuing a more collaborative approach. Tell us about the genesis of the Lincoln Initiative.
Well, Bill, we started Lincoln as a happy hour. My co-founder, Garrett Johnson, and I, we both work in technology. We both see the world through a more sort of libertarian, free market-oriented perspective. And, you know, we have an interest in civic engagement. And we thought that we can't be the only guys in Silicon Valley who fit that criteria. So we reached out to our individual networks and we put on 2 happy hours, one in Menlo Park near Stanford and one in San Francisco, with the assumption that it can't be too hard to get a group of good people together to drink. So we were successful. Between those 2 happy hours, 150 people came out, you know, spanning tech professionals who are technical and non-technical, who work at startups, also big tech, you know, also some lawyers and people in finance in the mix. And immediately after those happy hours, people started to ask, you know, what's next? This was great. How do we keep the momentum going? And that was almost 3 years ago. And now, you know, Lincoln is involved in providing online and offline engagement where we bring high-level speakers, both in tech and in politics, together to try to elevate thoughtful conversation about some of the important policy issues that we face as a country.
You co-authored a really interesting white paper titled Lobbying for the Future, which I recommend listeners Google up. Before we dig into the details, describe the scope and objectives of that work.
The title is suggestive of sort of the opposite, which is lobbying for the past, which is what much of D.C. is built on, you know, high-paid lobbyists and lawyers who can defend and do the bidding of big technology companies that were founded, you know, 20 years ago, you know, or 30 years ago. But, you know, I think it's inherent to the conversation that technology now is being created and innovation is advancing at such a rapid pace that we really need to be thinking about the future. We really need to be thinking about empowering those entrepreneurs who are going to be innovating at the bleeding edge of the technologies that are going to transform our economy and the way that we do business and the way that we live our lives and, you know, improve human well-being. But when you think about it, there's really no effort, there's no lobby to advocate for that future. And you really can't honestly, genuinely say that, well, that's the role of our elected officials to lobby for the future, to think about policies that are going to enable the innovation economy to thrive, because, you know, the vast majority of our elected officials, both in Congress and, you know, state legislatures around the country, have no idea what's happening in the innovation economy.
And entrepreneurs are too busy running their business to fly to Washington and beg for favors. Plus, they don't have the kind of cash that the entrenched companies do.
That's exactly right. You know, they are ramen profitable at best, you know, reaching out to family and friends to get their ventures off the ground. The last thing on their mind is buying a plane ticket to Washington, D.C. or making a contribution to go to a, you know, rubber chicken dinner.
So perhaps symptomatic of the whole problem, economic growth has pretty much ground to a halt in the U.S. and Western Europe. Some experts blame the regulatory burden, others blame dysfunctional monetary policy, and still others worry about the impact of the dinosaur businesses governments keep propping up with subsidies and bailouts. How do you see it?
Well, we see it as all of the above. You know, from our vantage point, we focus on the regulatory issues that really make it difficult or scare off either investment in certain industries or, try to intimidate entrepreneurs from entering certain industries because of the perceived regulatory burden that is involved. That could be, driverless cars or drones, or it could be the genetic innovation that 23andMe is moving forward. When signals are sent by, regulatory institutions, whether they be on a state or federal level, that because we don't understand a certain industry, we are going to slam the brakes on what's happening, that is bad for innovation. That's bad for our economy. So, essentially the government is saying that if we don't understand what you're doing, we're going to crush you. We're going to stand in the way of what you're trying to do. Not because it's bad or there is necessarily risk that are built in. It's simply because they don't understand what's happening, and that's the problem.
In looking at the entrepreneurs of the future, many young people seem to have been sold a bill of goods when it comes to a college education. They're graduating with degrees that confer few marketable skills while being buried under tens of thousands of dollars in debt. What can be done to better match the aspirations of our youth with the realities of the job market?
I think things that people are doing, like Peter Thiel. We had Blake Masters, who co-authored 0 to 1, the New York Times bestseller with Peter Thiel, talking about the fundamental concepts of launching transformative companies. And so Blake was at an event that we held in San Francisco last night, and he's the president of the Peter Thiel Foundation. And one of the things that they have launched is the Thiel Fellows Program, where they are finding, some of the most innovative young adults in the country and arguably in the world who are interested in advancing either some type of scientific research that could be commercialized or who are interested in launching transformative companies. And rather than, giving them a scholarship, a fellowship to do that within the confines of a traditional university, Peter Thiel is essentially paying them to drop out of college and giving them a pretty significant grant to pursue that entrepreneurial endeavor. And, for some people, that's too extreme. But I think that it's very clear that the traditional higher academic model is broken fundamentally. And so I think that there has to be those types of bold moves that can at least get a conversation going. And so, finding alternatives to traditional education, there's a YC company, a Y Combinator company that I'm familiar with the founders called Make School. And rather than a student going off to a 4-year university and perhaps studying CS, computer science, at a university, they are creating an alternative to a traditional 4-year university where it's sort of like an apprenticeship. They provide, really intensive hands-on education for high school students who have not yet graduated or high school students who perhaps have decided not to go to college. And then, they match these students after they go through the program with startups and large companies who are desperately in need of great engineers. So I think that, those types of models make a lot of sense.
How does the entrepreneurship rate amongst millennials stack up against prior generations?
There has been a steady decline over the past 30 years in the rate of new firm creation. So entrepreneurs across the spectrum of industries, not just tech, are choosing other fields. It's not that, the United States is not creating smart people or people who are risk takers or people, who have that potential to be entrepreneurs. For some reason, our system has been changed. There's been a shift in the system not to encourage that type of entrepreneurship. And unfortunately, that has led to this 30-year decline. And, there has been, somewhat of a recovery, arguably over the past decade since 2007, 2008. But there's some interesting research by the Economic Innovation Group that just came out recently demonstrating that this innovation, this increase in economic growth is really concentrated to, a handful of zip codes, that it's not stretching across the breadth of our country. And so you have, growth in a handful of area codes and significant decline, if not depression, in the vast majority of our country. And so that's a significant problem when you have, that type of disparity.
So, Garrett, back in the 1950s, barely 1 in 20 jobs required a government license, and now it's closer to 1 in 3 or 4. What impact has this had on economic growth and flexibility?
So in our report, Bill, we introduced the concept of Right to Work 2.0. So Right to Work 1.0 is the law in, I think, about 25 or 26 states around the country. And it essentially provides the ability to pursue one's profession without having to join a union. And that makes a lot of sense. And so, our concept of Right to Work 2.0 suggests that if I'm an entrepreneur and I want to start a company, I should not have to jump through the hoops that are created by various forms of occupational licensing boards in order to pursue that entrepreneurial venture. Having, licensing commissions and boards to a certain extent for some industries makes sense. But, one of the examples that we point out in the report is that in Louisiana, the rate of completing or passing the bar exam in Louisiana is higher than it is than a person who is trying to pass the licensing board to become a florist. That's a problem when it's more difficult and the rate of success in becoming a lawyer is higher than it is becoming a florist in Louisiana. And I think, when you look at the burden that these regulatory boards that is, often driven by crony capitalism, these occupational boards are governed by people who are, have vested interest in the industry, to maintain their stake, their position. Increasing competition is bad for them. And, they are on these boards. So, for example, there's a company called Zenefits. And Zenefits, for your listeners, do some research, just Google Zenefits, and you'll see some pretty sensational articles recently. But, if you just sort of push those controversies to the side, in the state of Utah, the commissioner of insurance for the state of Utah, who is a former elected official, registered as a Republican, but he is a insurance broker and insurance professional for his career. He went out of his way to try to block Zenefits from being able to operate in the state of Utah because he saw their potential to supplant his business, his profit model. And, you see examples like that in Texas where Tesla is barred from operating fully in the state of Texas because the automaker cabals that exist there. So, this is a bipartisan issue, and it's really a problem for our economy and for the entrepreneurs, that we need to create businesses.
How do millennials feel about the Austin fiasco where the city council rallied around the taxi medallion holders and chased Uber out of town?
That's another great example, Bill, that is fresh on the minds of lots of people around the country because I think, it's a signal that, this is where we could be heading in other states and other cities. But I was just with someone who lives in Austin yesterday, and she made clear that it's a disaster trying to get from point A to point B. Like many normal adults, she likes to drink alcohol. Drinking responsibly now becomes more difficult because you don't have the convenience of being able to get a driver wherever you are with a tap, with a few clicks on your phone. Getting to the airport becomes more difficult. One of my friends who's an entrepreneur, his wife is a lawyer, the entrepreneur husband, he travels a ton. And because of that, they only have one car. Well, now they have one car and two kids. Now their life becomes significantly more difficult because his primary, means of transportation was Uber or Lyft. And so you have these increased burdens being put on families in Austin because of short-sighted, knee-jerk reactions from some longtime elected officials on their county board of supervisors. So, I think most millennials feel this in a very intimate way because, this is one of the first times, certainly in their lifetimes and probably in history, where, you have the impact of regulation felt so broadly and so intimately. One of the remarks that Keith Boyce made last night, and Keith was, early employee at PayPal, one of the executives there, is now a venture capitalist and serial entrepreneur. He made the point that there are very few companies that can grow at such significant scale and still engender such love from their customers so as to, lead to this type of sort of groundswell of support. PayPal, one of those companies. He said that in the state of Louisiana, the state legislature essentially wanted to kill PayPal and run them out of business. Well, PayPal had 54,000 customers in Louisiana, and so they threatened to inform all of those customers of what the legislature was doing. And, that caused a different outcome because they were had the ability to rally their supporters. And Uber has that same type of groundswell of support. And so, unfortunately, we saw a very bad outcome from my perspective in Austin, but you saw a very different outcome in New York, where Bill de Blasio was essentially forced to reverse his decision to try and kill the business model for Uber in New York because of the groundswell of support that was generated in New York. And there's other examples of that across the country.
Do you think millennial voters will make their voices heard when the Austin City Council comes up for re-election?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a potential for that. When you look at an interesting model here in San Francisco, so there was a Proposition F in 2015 that essentially wanted to limit the ability for Airbnb, the on-demand sort of a housing share service. They wanted to limit the ability for Airbnb to operate in San Francisco. And as you know, San Francisco has a sort of horrific problem with just a housing crisis and skyrocketing rent, not enough inventory. And so the county board of supervisors wanted to kill or at least significantly limit the ability for Airbnb to operate. And so what Airbnb did was they rallied their vocal, very loyal customers in San Francisco to push back on that proposition. It created a significant split within the sort of Democratic regime in San Francisco. The old guard, former mayor, now senator from California, Barbara Feinstein, came out in support of it. Some, older mayors, former mayors of San Francisco came out in support of it. But the current mayor, Ed Lee, who is, he's still very progressive, very, a big government guy, but pro-innovation economy, came out in support of blocking Proposition F. Gavin Newsom, former mayor of San Francisco, now lieutenant governor, came out in support. And, because of the groundswell that Airbnb was able to generate, they were able to block that proposition from moving forward. And so their ability to rally support in favor of blocking Proposition F led to the outcome that they wanted. So that indicates that it's possible to get people to turn out to the polls and vote. But I think this is going to be sort of something that evolves and develops over time, and we'll have to see if millennials are able to, distract themselves sufficiently from their phones, tweeting and snapping to actually go and, make their voices heard at the ballot box.
Those are two issues that directly impact consumers, but there are lots of other structural problems that stymie entrepreneurs that are largely invisible. Many entrepreneurs have been complaining about our broken patent system. And reform initiatives appear to be stalled because there's always someone whose ox gets gored and the lobbyists surround a bill and kill it. Break it down for us. What are the key problems in our current patent system?
Patents are one of the primary ways that the government regulates innovation. Part of sort of the constitutional intent to help to advance, scientific and useful arts. And so, there is a role for the government to play here. But, the fundamental point that we make in our patent report that we release and also the report Lobbying for the Future is that, the system is broken. And, one of the main drivers of the dysfunction is what people call patent trolls. People who create frivolous patents in order to essentially just try to sit on innovation and try to extract money out of innovators and entrepreneurs who are building new technologies or building new models and methodologies. Unbeknownst to them, someone has some frivolous patent that they now have to contend with legally and, spend money that they don't have on lawyers and deal with the hassle of fighting this in court in order to build their company and to develop the technology. So patent trolls exist because we have a broken patent model where people are able to submit, very just basic, trivial, frivolous technologies to be patented, and they are issued a patent. And part of it is because the patent office, their revenue model is through people paying fees for these patents. And so, we need to change fundamentally how the patent office is funded so that they are not beholden, perverse incentives. The more patents we issue, the more fees we can charge. The more fees we can charge, the larger our budget.
Right.
So that needs to be changed. And then the model of reviewing and issuing patents needs to be more strenuous, as well as legally reducing the ability for patent trolls to enforce legal pressure on companies. So there's a range of issues that need to happen. But Bill, you are very informed of this issue as well. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on?
We could go on for hours. I've spent most of my career in patent litigation. A lot of it is that these examiners are overwhelmed and too much gets through that's covered by prior art. I've always recommended people go to crowdsourcing to uncover prior art. Basically have the examiner post a patent at its final stages before it's approved and let everybody out there on the internet say, hey, wait a minute, here's something that's 10 years older than that invalidates it. That would solve a lot of the problems. Listen, in the time we have left, Garrett, let's move on to one big regulatory reform that you covered in your white paper, which is the REINS Act. How is that supposed to work?
Right now, when you look at examples like Obamacare or Dodd-Frank, Obamacare, significant changes to healthcare, Dodd-Frank Act, significant changes to financial regulation.
Hundreds of millions.
Just massive, mind-boggling to think about the impact that these pieces of legislation that were passed by Congress will have on our economy and have on entrepreneurs and financial professionals. So what the REINS Act suggests is that the practice of Congress passing these large, sweeping pieces of legislation and then essentially deferring much of the regulatory implementation to unelected bureaucrats. And bureaucrats has become somewhat of a pejorative word. I do not in any way suggest that there aren't really smart, competent people in government agencies who are doing good work. What I am suggesting is that they weren't elected. The American people elected our members of Congress to govern in the best interest of their constituents. And so what the REINS Act suggests is fairly simple, that there needs to be more accountability in the legislative process. And the REINS Act would essentially prevent Congress from passing these sweeping piece of legislation and then pushing off the granular, detailed rulemaking to unelected regulators. And I think it's a very important piece of legislation.
Well, it's a fundamental delegation of powers issue.
It is. It is transferring important legislative power that is constitutionally vested in Congress to the executive branch. And so it's a really, really flawed, bad transfer of power.
Well, Garrett, I appreciate you spending time with us today. Good luck with the Lincoln Initiative, and good luck with your own startup, SendHub.
Well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate you having me.
That was Garrett Johnson from the Lincoln Initiative, co-author of Lobbying for the Future, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Build your brand by aligning it with high-quality content on Real Clear Radio Hour. For corporate underwriting opportunities, contact producer at realclearradio.org. Ahead, we'll speak with Eileen Norcross from the Mercatus Center about the dire fiscal condition of many of our nearly bankrupt states. Stay tuned.